How are you guys going to get future funding? Let's say everything that you stated that you're going to build has been built. Are you going to have some sort of, voting mechanism, through a funding mechanism that way?
Well, it's funny you should mention that. We're actually going to launch with on-chain governance, hopefully within the next week and a half. We're running the beta tests right now with some of our community, and this is going to be the first on-chain governance in all of Cardano. In terms of securing funding into the future, look, I funded this project through trading, right? So I'm a trader. I funded this project by by trading my way into this project, I guess you'd say. I run a hedge fund. I don't really know any other way to say it. I run a hedge fund. I garner funding through that hedge fund. So I fund this project through a separate business, which is part of the reason why we didn't need VC funds. It's part of the reason why we didn't do any large-scale investment. This one was entirely funded by ourselves. And as long as I am able to do that, I intend on continuing to do that. And at the moment, we don't seem to be having any issue continuing to do that. If a time arises that we do need funding, that's when you go speak to VCs. That's when you go speak to others about what it is that we can actually set up. But until such a time, I don't want to, will myself into needing funding. So yes, at the moment, it's self-managed, self-funded through my other business.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate you being so open about that information. All of these features that you guys have, all of these, products, are any of them audited? By any third party, and will you guys be moving towards that in the future, if not?
Yeah, we've already set ourselves up to be audited by Tweag, TWEAG. They're one of the largest auditors in the Pluto space. They did Sunday and they did MinSwap. We are working with WellTyped as internal auditors. So WellTyped are a business the founders of WellTyped were one of the original designers of Haskell. So the reality is that once we get WellTyped. We've been working with WellTyped to look over our contracts, but they're not making any public announcements in terms of auditing. That's why they're called internal auditors. Their job is to ensure that we're meeting our own design standards and to work with us to ensure that we're meeting our own design standards. Then once they're all complete, we hand them over to the external auditors, Tweag. And then once Tweag have looked over that, we'll have completed our external audit. We do intend to have that complete before we launch our DEX.
What levels of risk, are people undertaking when they're interacting with, some of these products?
There's a few. So first and foremost, when holding VyFi, you're of course have VyFi risk, right? You're holding the risk of our token. So if VyFi drops, the value of your token that you're holding drops. That's just a little bit how it works. Another one, once you're invested in liquidity pools, you hold impermanent risk, which is essentially the risk that the values of the tokens change. And as the value of the tokens change, you gain or lose the token. Well, in general, you gain the token that loses the most value, right? So if you're in a liquidity pool with ADA VyFi, and then VyFi drops by half, you're going to find that you have 50% more VyFi in the liquidity pool and 50% less ADA. So in that motion, you've now lost income, or you've now lost asset value. We've actually got a description of impermanent loss, a bit of an in-depth description of impermanent loss in our Git books. I do suggest anyone who is intending on managing impermanent risk through liquidity pools to give that a look.
That was a pretty good explanation. When you got these two token pools of money, when someone's selling, they have to deposit one and take another, and, you're the one that's getting the other, so that's definitely a huge risk with impermanent loss. Sorry for cutting you off there. Continue.
No. But that's exactly it. That description is exactly it. You're going to be gaining the token, losing value, right? And then, of course, I guess at the moment, the other big one, of course, is political risk. God, that one's huge at the moment, because we don't know exactly what regulation is going to be in a year's time, right? So it's really important for users to recognize that as a result of the risk of not knowing where we're going to be in the next period of time, we're not going to have access to the perfect knowledge, I guess is what I'm trying to say. We're not going to have access to know exactly how these are going to be managed from a governmental perspective in 2 years.
Yeah. And that's pretty important, because you almost have to, in the traditional industry, a lot of people building financial products, they're almost designing them based on the regulation. And we're in such a weird gray area right now where we can't even design products based on the regulation because we don't even know what the regulation is going to be. You know, it's
That's
very
exactly
unfortunate.
it, right? So and this isn't just ourselves, this is with any
It's
cryptocurrency
everybody.
project,
It's everybody.
right? You hold political risk. And that's something that really users should be aware of because it does have a big impact on price, as we saw recently with the launch of the war in Ukraine, right? So even global events and regulations combine to make a choppy environment, is what we'd call it in the markets, a choppy market. And when you have a choppy market, people can start to panic and people can start to sell. That is the action of political risk. When it impacts a market, you'll see a market go really choppy and then you'll see a market drop. This is something that users need to be aware can happen.
Okay. What about like smart contract risk? You know, is there, have you, because, you know, Plutus is new. You know, we're all kind of building these products for the first time ever. And the difference between, you know, here and Ethereum is, you know, a lot of, you know, new projects or products coming out are just, you know, copy paste of another Solidity project, you know. So should users be worried about, you know, smart contract risk, you know, when interacting with any of these products?
I'm a lot less worried about smart contract risk on Cardano due to the design of the language itself being based in Haskell, which is a functional programming language, rather than being based in Solidity, which is object-oriented. To give a bit of a better description of that, rather than just using big words, an object-oriented language essentially has structures, and then you interact with these structures. The example I like to use is with a door. In object-oriented programming, you would say, this is a door. Now I would like to conduct the action of opening the door. So then you can open it. Whereas in functional programming, you have to outline the actual risks. So you have to outline the actual object themselves. So you would have to design the concept of a door. What are the moves that a door can make? And then once I've designed the outline of a door and I've designed what actions I can take on a door, I can then implement those actions on the door. So it's a much more bottom-up construction process. Being a much more bottom-up construction process means that there are mathematical securities that we can implement into the smart contract to ensure that we don't get errors forming as we see in Ethereum, So the way that I like to envision it is very much like a Mac back in 2012, a Mac computer. And they had that ad about Mac computers versus Microsoft computers and how Mac didn't have viruses. If we think of smart contract risk as a virus, right? When this is initially released, there's going to be a lot of work that needs to be done by criminals to understand how they can actually take advantage of the systems as they're designed, right? Because it's a lot more mathematically sound. In so doing, I think that initially, and this is I think, I don't know for sure, I think that initially you're going to find that there's a lot less smart contract risk on Cardano than you have on Ethereum, as long as, you know, you have a audited project and people have looked over it to ensure that the code itself hasn't been designed in a way that allows for negative things to happen.
That makes a lot of sense, and I really appreciate that explanation. I've never really heard of it described in that way. You know, this idea of when you're actually, you know, building these objects, that you're setting the functionality, you know, you're almost creating the limits by creating what it can possibly do. So I really appreciate that explanation. I think that really kind of expanded on that a little for me, and it really makes sense because, you know, it is called a functional programming language. So you're designing it with the functions in mind. So thank you for that. That was very useful.
And a classic example, one of the most classic forms of rug pull is where someone finds the capacity to be able to put in, let's say, one BNB, and then they can skew it so that the one BNB pays them out the entire liquidity pool, right? That's draining liquidity, right? When people find a bug that allows you to drain liquidity. That can't really happen in Cardano. That can't happen in Cardano. Because in Cardano, you would actually have the construction of the function, the object itself, which says, but if these two numbers, I can't put in a number here and then give out a number higher on the other side, right? That in itself goes against the actual construction of the object. That object would instantly reject it. So that function is going to be rejected.
So And no one would actually, unless they're trying to do something nefarious, no one would write that function in there.
No. Unless you're trying to do something nefarious, the businesses that are working on Cardano aren't going to build it with that capacity. Yeah. And that's why I do say it is important that we have other businesses that look over the smart contracts being released. I've never been a fan of just throwing money into smart contracts that are completely unaudited and from unknown businesses, right? Like when you suddenly see a random DEX appear on the BNB chain and people flood their money into it, and it's like, well, they've got a hidden team. You don't know who they are. They've got no name. They've never been in the space before. What do I know about this smart contract? So there's a level there of, one, you need auditing to ensure that businesses are being honest, and that's super important. And secondly, you need to have visibility to ensure that people can actually interact, engage, and talk to the business that are managing these products, right? Because if the businesses are invisible, well, that's just, again, more risk.